I love what you said about adolescence, particularly the knock at the door, self-actualization. But here's what I'm personally struggling with 3 adolescents, is that quest for autonomy. Seems to override everything else. No matter how much we say you need to take care of your soul, you need to go to church with us, you need to, and that's our family. We're very structured, we're methodical, and pray at dinner and pray out in public, and but struggling with pushing past the autonomy. Any good advice?
Thank you. Here's a wonderful scientific study that you'll love. You looked at teens, and they sure love to be together. They're herd-bound, right? So I'm leaving, I'm autonomous, but not alone. I'm with my group, my herd. And the herd meets in the den, or in the basement, or at the McDonald's. The herd is onto its own. We went in there, and we asked what they were talking about. We asked to get a flavor, and we used quantitative measures, and what we saw was that they are very hard at work on life's ultimate questions. And although they may seem to be pushing pretty hard against you, the way they ask those questions and the depth and register of their search correlates directly with you. All of the work that we do in the first decade and a half goes into those private circles and shapes their engagement in their collective spiritual journey. So you're there.
Do you have anything to share about autistic children and how spiritual awakening can help with that, or how you could?
Do you have a sense about that? Do you have a thought about
No,
that?
I wanted to hear yours.
Okay. I'm happy to answer that. There is not a great deal, excuse me, the question was the spirituality of children with autism. And it's a very, very profound question. There's not much, I don't think there's any science that directly addresses it. I have had so many experiences where parents, where professionals, where students who work with autistic children say, they are so spiritual. I cut right through and I'm connecting at the level of spirit. So in the lived clinical and personal experience, I've heard many statements like that. But I don't have any science for you, and it's a needed area for research. Thank you.
My question is in relationship to children of incarcerated parents whose parents have not had a spiritual awakening. How does that affect, and how do you engage the spirit of the child, or I guess that's how I want to phrase my question, because they have not, their parents didn't experience the rebirth, and now we have a child who hasn't.
Thank you. Did everyone hear that? Okay, let me share with you. Do you mind if I answer you in science? Is that okay? Okay. First of all, we looked at children of moms who were opiate addicted. And of the moms who were opiate addicted, over 92% of moms who were opiate addicts did not feel a strong spirituality. But we looked at their children, and the children showed the same high level of spirituality shown in a national sample. So the child, mean age 11, before puberty, still had it. Okay? Then we went to the children, and we looked to see with whom were they similar in their spiritual life. If not their mom, was it a grandma? Was it her partner? Was it a committed, loving family friend, aunt, someone at their house of worship? And what we found was that the child finds the person with the most healthy, thriving form of spirituality and drinks it in. The child has a natural spiritual compass and a natural process of selective spiritual socialization. So all we've got to do is show up and get them that person. And it's very often in a faith community. A committed, loving, long-term presence of love, of bond, that special interwoven bond of human love, filled with the sacred presence. It's human love and bond plus sacred presence that fills the child and builds their own spirituality. It comes through the loving, guiding, what I call the ambassador. Right? Yeah. Should I tell the subway story? Maybe real briefly? Okay. I was on the subway. This is in the book, and I'm sharing it now for a reason, in the midst of this scientific inquiry. And I was stuck on why is it that spirituality is so profoundly protective in kids. But in the science, I was seeing this patchwork, and I had to understand it. Going up to work one day, I'm on this, waiting on the subway in August in New York, and it was quite warm, and the cars were quite packed, and they roll through, and everyone's squeezed in. And then there's one car, that's empty. And I thought, oh, good, I'll get in that car. And I got in that car, and what I realized very quickly was that the car was empty because 90% of the car was empty, but everyone had packed down at one end because of one man. There was one man, a homeless man, who was sitting alone. And he was frustrated, and he was alienated, and he was yelling out to have a connection. And as each person got on the car, he said, hey, do you want some of my lunch? Hey, do you want some of my lunch? And everyone ignored him and walked to the far end of the car. Every stop, looked at him, walked away, until finally, at 145th Street, the door opens up, and on walks the most beautiful couple, an elegant grandmother with a pillbox hat and veil and gloves, and her beautiful granddaughter with little gloves in pastels, and they're obviously off to church. And the question comes, hey, do you want some of my lunch? You want to come sit with me? And there they stand, and they look at each other, and they nod, eye to eye, looking forward, and they say, yes. And they walk over, and they sit down immediately next to him, right by his side. Hey, you want some of my lunch? They look at each other, they nod, no thank you. And this goes round and round and round. You want lunch? No thank you. Nod, every time a nod. And it occurred to me that that nod was the passing of the torch. The child had natural spirituality, that the grandma was the ambassador, and in the nod was passed the torch of the spiritual life. When I asked that of the data, the whole story came into perspective. It's not merely natural spirituality, the 27%, but it's spirituality cultivated in the loving bond with the ambassador, the field of love that is human love infused with sacred love, that fills the child with a powerful spirituality. It doesn't need to be the mom, right? As you know, it can be the grandma. But that child sure knows what that feels like, and it's all in the nod.
Well, I'm a psychologist who doesn't always know how to approach clients with spirituality. I can ask about faith, but usually with adults, not with teens, though I do work with children and teens, but I'm not sure how to do that. So maybe you have some suggestions.
I think foremost, we meet them where they are, as you know well. And very often, with the love and the interest in the healing relationship, spirituality naturally emerges. But it also comes, I think if we look into development and preventative work, in offering between that 27% and 100% gifts that ambassadors can offer. A language, just like we name chair, roof, fireman, we can say, I feel the presence of God in my heart. I see the sunset, and I know that we're part of this great creation. A constant language of spiritual life, whatever that may sound like in a family. Language, transparency. I think that as parents, teachers, healers, people of service, we can speak in the first person about spiritual life. And that is entirely non-coercive in any setting to have an authentic spiritual voice. A child can be invited in our family to sit by our side as we meditate or pray, or to hear my own questions as a parent. I felt disconnected today, and so I went and I prayed, or I went to the beach and I felt the illumination to be transparent in our own spiritual life for our children. And then I think the final piece that is now totally validated by science is to have spirituality at the center of our vision of development. Because whether or not we happen to be working in a faith community, the child has the spiritual clock running. And our omission is a deprivation. It's like not feeding a child or not giving them adequate fresh air. Our omission is a starvation. And so to be informed, as people already in this room may be, but our general culture might more generally embrace a view that shifts away from the performance being on earth to a sacred, spiritual path on earth.
Have you ever witnessed significant cortical spikes in people that become more spiritual, like later on in life, rather than all the way throughout?
It's a beautiful question. And I think the point is so very valuable that we can have a deep spiritual awakening at any point in life, and that a developmental depression may occur for the first time in adolescence, but it occurs, and our culture actually intuits that this quest that presents itself first as a knock on the door reoccurs with so-called midlife crisis, right, with adult coming of age. There's plenty of times where we have lay terms for a bump in the road at a chapter in living. Those are spiritual opportunities. So spiritual awakening can come at any time in life. The question that you asked specifically has not been addressed by science yet, but I can answer it offering you some first cousin studies. We invited people into the lab, not looking at the structure of their brain as structural MRI, but looking at the brain as it's working in functional MRI. And we had them come in and tell us two stories. One story was a real moment in their life in a state of great stress. And one very common thing that we saw was that while they told the story about stress, their body started to show the same physiological expression of actually being under stress. Then we shifted stories, and the second story was about their relationship with the higher power, the transcendent relationship, whatever language that might be. And we watched a different set of physiological correlates unfold. Looking through the MRI, in the stress condition, we saw light up the insula and striatum, which are those portions of the brain associated with craving and addiction. Stress is about craving, and it runs the same craving machine found in addiction. When they shifted from the stress experience, the hunger, the craving, to the relationship with the higher power, the craving areas ceased to light up, no more blood flow. And instead what we saw light up were the same regions of the brain to go thick over time structurally, the cortex of the parietal and occipital regions, which look increasingly to be areas of not just perception, but spiritual perception as well. So use of the brain, right, to engage in craving or to engage in the relationship with the transcendent loving relationship. Use of the brain naturally carries a different functional capacity, which over time leads to a different structural capacity. We can start that any day. We can start that this moment right now. The differential use of our brain for the transcendent relationship versus the constant hunger. Because whether I'm hungry for alcohol or success or anything else, I'm hungry. And the rich faith traditions say a lot about craving as a slide to suffering.
Lisa, thank you. Have you done any studies on experiences during contemplative practice or early morning hours when dreaming, which has a very similar wavelength in the brain, and the spiritual effects that you see or studied?
There was a study done by Sarah Lazar at Harvard who had people come in and meditate versus have a nice, friendly group experience but not meditate. And they did this none of them had meditated before, weekly, for 8 weeks, asked to practice at home between weekly sessions. And what she found in 20-somethings, these folks were between 20 and 29, was that after 8 weeks of novice, sustained, regular meditation practice, she actually started picking up structural changes. Right? So it happens quick. Well, certainly among 20-somethings, but it hasn't been done in all epochs of life. It appears that it is there. It appears that it is there.